So hopefully this video in a way can be, you know, a unifying thing for a very divisive topic, right? For this video, we're not going to be talking about what the public opinion is on the matter, yeah, because it's very divided, but it seems to be a minority opinion at the moment that there ought to be reparations, right? So we're not talking about that, we're not talking about politics of it, but for this video, hopefully whether you're in favour of it or you're against it, it's, you know, it's going to be useful for you. So if you're against reparations, hopefully this video gives you a lot of like ammunition within your argument. And again, if you're in favour of it, hopefully this also gives you like some ammunition as well, gives you some food for thought. Because what you have to understand with this issue is it's almost like a scale, yeah? I kind of like realised this while making it up, right? So there's a scale from least fair to fairest. And there's also a scale from least complex to most complex. So the most complex solution is actually going to be the fairest solution, right? And the least complex is also going to be the least fair, right? So we'll get into this in a little bit. So it sounds a bit confusing, a bit cryptic now, but as the video goes on, hopefully that will make a bit more sense. So even if we just grandfather in that, yes, we're all 100% in favour of it, yeah, let's just say for argument's sake, we're all on the same boat and we all want it, right? But we're arguing now about how it should be implemented, right? So within all of this, there's three main questions that we have to ask, right? The first question is how much should be paid out? The second is who should receive it? And the third is who should pay it. And these are three fundamental questions which if we can't answer, then there is no argument about reparations, right? So this is what this video is going to try and look into. So just for a little bit of clarity, reparations is paying money for past transgressions, right? So if I assaulted you in the past, then I have to pay you reparations. I have to give you financial, or I have to give you some sort of support in order to help you get through the fact that I wronged you in the past. So there have been many examples of this reparations, and we'll get onto some other examples a little bit later. But, you know, the most pressing one that we can think of is the case between Israel and West Germany in 1952. So 1952, this is just 7 years after the Holocaust, and West Germany did a deal with Israel in which they agreed over a period of about 12 years to give them compensation for the loss of property and for the damages done during the Holocaust. So what we have to think of is obviously Israel got its independence in 1948, and it was a very war-racked country. It only just survived like kind of the war in 1948 against all the Arabs, and it was obviously, it needed a lot of infrastructure, it needed a lot of development, it needed basically a boost to its economy. And obviously the survivors of the Holocaust had many of their possessions taken away from them by the Nazi regime. And so Israel went to West Germany, because obviously East and West Germany was divided at this point. You know, East Germany did not pay them anything, and neither did any of the other communist countries of Eastern Europe. So West Germany was the only country that was willing to, and so yeah, so the burden kind of fell on them. So the figures that you can see on the bottom of the screen here, of this $120 billion, which was given out over this time, this is the calculations I've got to find these figures, right? So if I've made a mistake, please correct me in the comment section, but this is just from the findings I've looked at, this is what I've found, right? So it seems to be roughly about $120 billion in today's money, right? Which was given from the state of West Germany to Israel. So this represented, over this 12-year period, it represented around 15% of Israel's GNP growth, right? So that's quite significant, right? And roughly about a third of Israel's electricity needs were set up through this. Roughly about half of Israel's railway infrastructure was set up through this. So if we think about Israel today, it's a tech hub, it's an innovation hub, people from all around the world, with different startups and everything. So Israel today is an absolute powerhouse, right? But if they hadn't received this early infrastructure, and this early help, like from like the reparations from West Germany, would they be as advanced as they are today? Probably not. Like, it would have been quite difficult for them to have just got this 120 billion some other way, right? So in many ways, Israel today is as prosperous as it currently is, partly because it received this reparations. But although many people point to this and say, look, this is an example of people paying reparations, right? The problem with this is that, and this is what you'll find in many other like cases of reparations being paid to people, the vast majority of the cases, it's been people who have lived through and suffered through certain like ills, and within their lifetime they as individuals have received compensation for crimes done to them as individuals, right? So you're not talking about people like descendants of people whose ancestors were put through these things. You're talking about people in life, like who had actually suffered these things. So this is where some of the complexities of around like this argument kind of falls apart, because if we talk about the emancipation of slavery within the British Empire, that happened in 1838. If we're talking about emancipation with regard to the United States, that happened in 1865. So no one is alive today who was alive back then, right? So there's no slave owners, right? And there's no slaves, right, who are still alive like from that time. So many of the arguments with regard to reparations for slavery, yeah, it becomes a bit more complex. We're not going to talk about in this video about the argument with regard to reparations for colonization. We've kind of covered that in some of our other videos. If you'd like me to go into more depth in that in a future video, please let me know. But again, it's a lot more complicated than one might expect, right? If you actually drill down into the data, it's a question of how much should be paid into who, and should there even be any money paid, etc., etc. So it's very, very complicated. So for this video, when we talk about reparations, we're talking about reparations in the context of transatlantic slavery. And again, just to make it even clearer, we're talking about slavery with regard to the English-speaking world, right? So we're talking about America, and we're talking about the British Empire in the Caribbean. We're not talking about the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the French Empire, all of which like obviously had many, many slaves, and we're not talking about any other empires either. Like we're just talking about, you know, for the sake of brevity, England, and we're talking about America, right? So that's all we're talking about. So now we're going to be talking about the simpler part of the debate with regard to reparations, and that's going to be focusing on the British Empire. And notice I say the word simpler instead of simple, because it's still incredibly complicated, right? But it's way simpler than is the case for American reparations, right? So we're going to drill down into this, right? So Britain, at the time of emancipation, signed into law that there was going to be compensation for the slave owners, because you have to understand that at that time, people obviously viewed the slaves as the property of the people, right? And so it was seen as a thing where the British government couldn't deprive people of their property without giving them just compensation, right? So as a result, the slave owners were given compensation, and they were given £20 million, right? So in today's figures, that equates to about £2.6 billion, right? And this was given to 40,000 slave owners, and this was for the price of 665,000 slaves, right? This is the total number of slaves in the British Caribbean. So this means that each slave owner on average received about £65,000, right, from the British taxpayers. And actually this figure was not fully paid off until 2015. So like, you know, so even their descendants were still receiving some money with regard to paying this off. So that's something we have to kind of bear in mind as well, that this isn't like ancient history. This was finally sorted out in 2015, because like it kind of dragged on for that amount of time. So if we take that figure and divide it amongst each slave, we can see that the slave owners received about £30 per slave, and when translated in today's figures, that's about £3,925 per slave. So this is the cost of a slave in the eyes of the British government. So obviously some people received much more than this. Some people received like millions and millions of pounds because they owned many, many slaves. However, we can kind of work out roughly from the figures here that on average, the average slave owner seemed to have owned about 16 slaves, because, you know, if we take this figure and divide it by that figure, then that's what it kind of seems to indicate. So this is why I say the argument is simpler, right? Because we have clear written records of the government giving money to this person, that person, this person, that person for this many slaves, and you know, so it's all clearly written down and it's all clearly documented, right? So we can see from this which families received how much and, you know, and for how many slaves. Now let's start off with the least complex solution to this, right? And it's also, as you'll see, going to be the least fair, which is this. If we took £2.6 billion in today's figures and divided it amongst the 6 million people of the English-speaking Caribbean, because obviously English-speaking Caribbean, they're the ones who were part of the British Empire, so we're not talking about all the other places in the Caribbean. Just talking about the English-speaking Caribbean, it's roughly 6 million people. So if we took that £2.6 billion and divided it equally amongst the 6 million English-speaking Caribbeans, we can see that each person would receive £433 in today's figure. So if you had a family of 5, then that family would receive about £2,165. So just to give a little bit of context of this, the GDP for Jamaica in 2018 was about $15 billion, right? So if you convert that into pounds, that's roughly 13 billion pounds or thereabouts. So let's just keep it very simple. So Jamaica represents about half of the population of the former British West Indies now. So, there's about 3 million people in Jamaica, there's about 6 million people in the English-speaking Caribbean as a whole. So we can kind of see from this that if we were to take this money and divide it equally amongst the people there, it would actually boost the economy of the English-speaking West Indies up by about 10% of their GDP or thereabouts, right? So if I've got some of the figures wrong in that, excuse me, some of the figures like fluctuate year on year. It's a little bit complicated, so yeah, but let's just take that as a given. So 10% of their GDP. So if we were to basically uplift the economy of the West Indies by an extra 10%, that could have great long-term ramifications. So there could be more infrastructure being spent on different things. There could be different health, different education initiatives, all these kind of things, right? Different business initiatives to kind of get them more going and stuff, like in terms of new tech hubs, etc. So there's lots of things which could be done within that, or even just like tackling poverty, just giving that money just to the poorest people in those societies. However, this is where we start to really understand that this is coming up against the more philosophical part of it. And this is why I say the least fair solution is also the least complicated. This is very simple. This is just taxing people in Britain and then giving money to the governments in the Caribbean. But the problem with all this is that there's obviously a lot of complexities with that, right? Not every person who's in the British Caribbean is the descendant of a slave. And not every person in Britain is a descendant of a slave owner. So this is where we kind of start to really kind of have to scale it down. So for instance, just taking me as an example, right? On my mum's side, right, I'm from Barbados. So I was obviously the descendant of a slave. So should I as a British person be paying taxes and then not receiving the just compensation within the system? And then also as well, bear in mind that there's still many people who are the direct descendants of slave owners who are living in the Caribbean. Would they receive money from this? So what, would I as a descendant of a slave be paying the descendant of a slave owner? And then never mind obviously the more recent immigrants to the Caribbean, etc., etc. That's it's all just very complicated. So let's take it up another notch of fairness and complexity. Okay, let's say all the descendants of former slaves in the Caribbean. So we're not talking about American slavery because they got their independence in 1776. So that's an American problem from that point on. We're just talking about emancipation within the British Empire, which is mainly just the British Caribbean. So should we just take all the people who are direct descendants of Caribbean slaves? Well, that gets very complicated because obviously, again, people move, right? So there's people who are in Canada, people in America, people in Australia, people in France, people all over the world, right? So if you're going to pay the descendants of every Caribbean slave, that's going to get very, on a logistical basis, that's going to get very complicated to do, right? And then never mind the fact that there's obviously many people in the Caribbean who live in the UK as well. So that's obviously very complex. So let's say, for instance, right, we get all the white people and we do a tax on all the white people and we give it to all the black people. Okay, well then not every black person is the descendant of a slave, right? Not every black person is from the Caribbean, So, and then not every white person, either is from Britain in the first place, people from Poland, Ireland, etc., etc. But then on top of that, we're talking, as we've said here, 40,000 families. Britain at that time had a population of 20 million. So you're talking about a tiny, tiny proportion of people who owned slaves versus the vast majority of people who didn't own slaves. Yes, you can say obviously many people benefited from it. There were some slave owners who put money into railways and into the British Museum and many other kind of national art galleries, etc., etc. So there was some slave owners who put money back into the British economy in a way which benefited the population as a whole. But for the most part, this money was a transfer of money from the taxpayer to the elites who are already incredibly wealthy because they own slaves. It's obviously not cheap to have these slaves. So you're talking about people already incredibly wealthy and the rest of us who are not descendants of them having to foot the bill for them. So this is inherently not fair. It's a little bit more complex, so it's a little bit fairer, but it still isn't really fair. Okay, so let's say we do probably the most fair thing, yeah, right, and the most complex, right? Let's find all the descendants of the slave owners, because we've got the figures here, we can see which families it was, we can see how much they received, and let's go to them and let's just do a special tax on them and say, you received this much, you need to give this much, and then all of their descendants, you go, right, here you go, like, you know. So, okay, that in theory works, right? However, what if, you know, because obviously you're talking about an expanse of like well over 150 years, right? So, you know, so some of these families, their financial circumstances might have changed over that time, right? So a family which might have received £1 million back then might now be on benefits, right? Whereas a family which received like £4,000 might have owned like one slave, you know, all of a sudden now they might be worth £1 billion, right? So how are you taking this figure from these people, and like how are you working it out? And then also people obviously have many descendants, and then obviously it's, you know, the whole issue is very complicated. I hope that you understand like this part of it already, right? You're starting to get the idea that the issue is incredibly complicated and that it's not a one size fits all thing, and it's not a simple thing of, right, let's do this and then pay this out, etc., etc. So even ignoring all the politics about whether this would ever happen, the public opinion, the politics about this, the different party politics, etc., etc. Even if everything was yes, 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 let's get this done, how do we get this done? This is the inherent problem, right? How much should be paid? Right, so in this case here, we've at least ticked that thing off, right? This is how much should be paid, 2.6 billion. Who should pay it? Don't know. Who should receive it? Don't know. This is part of the problem. You know, so yeah, so this is, as I said, the simpler one. Now we're going to get onto America, which is even more complicated than this case.